From the Shadows by Huzefa Johar. Prologue, Chipiona, Spain, November 1879. Pulsating dots of green and blue appeared at the edge of consciousness and slowly spiraled towards the center, sometimes leaving a luminous trail in their wake, which was again swallowed by darkness. As the dots moved closer to the center, another progression of green and blue specks emerged at the edge and rapidly traced a spiral path to conjoin with the first set of dots. Flickering specks of green and blue merged to form a white dot, which rapidly grew in size and intensity as all other specks merged into it. What began as a white speck was now a circle of white brilliance amidst a wide expanse of darkness. For a few moments it shimmered with unfaltering brilliance, and then the circle of brilliance expanded rapidly, obliterating the darkness that had persisted until that moment. The man opened his eyes and stared up at the blank white ceiling. The portion of the ceiling directly above his head reflected the yellow light of a dancing flame, and presently his limbs felt the icy pang of cold water in which his body lay submerged. In one swift motion, he grabbed the sides of the polished marble basin and pivoted to his feet, sending tiny rivulets of water cascading down from either sides of the marble bath. Stepping out, he grabbed a white linen cloth that lay folded on a bench. He draped the fabric around his well-built frame and gently rubbed his body dry. Bending over, he scooped a heap of clothes and started laying them on the bench. A black trouser, a black robe of fine silk unadorned except for a light filigree on the sleeves, a white linen inner shirt, and breeches made of black wool. The linen that draped his body felt wet now, so he peeled it off and hastily donned his simple fineries. The narrow doorway leading out of the bath chamber emerged into a well-lit corridor, the far side of which was lined with polished glass. He paused outside the door and pulled out a white keffiyeh from a pocket. Studying his reflection in the glass, he carefully positioned the keffiyeh over his head and tightened it with a circlet of black linen. Turning right, he walked down the passage, past the line of bath chambers. At the end of the passage, there was a large desk set against a wood-paneled wall. A rather plump-looking man with drooping eyebrows was seated at the desk. He looked up once and with his thick fingers clasped the silver coin that was deposited on the desk. Arun Yildikim walked out of the balneario feeling fresh and rejuvenated. A direct avenue led from the balneario to his ensuing destination, the biblioteca, library. But Arun sought exertion, and a walk along the winding beach seemed desirable. As it was still several hours to noon, the tide was out, so he traversed over the dunes until he reached the firm sand that marked the furthest point of tidal inundation. Far to the northwest, the Faro lighthouse appeared resplendent under the morning sun. At this time of the day, the sea was dotted with fishing skiffs, and somewhere in the dunes a lark had begun to sing. For nearly an hour he traversed the crooked coast, listening to the howl of the wind and basking in the warmth of the Andalusian sun. A particularly large wave crashed onto the sandbank, its fury dissipating into a tranquil cascade that spread over the beach. The next wave was fiercer, sending a cascade further up the beach, a sure sign of the turning tide. And as Arun trundled over a patch of sea holly, he noticed that the skiffs were now heading shoreward, and after a brief passage of time he came across a party of fishermen heaving their boat over a dune. A middle-aged man waved in his direction, and Arun paused to greet the man.
Buenos dias. ¿Has tenido una buena pesquera hoy? Did you have a good catch today? Arun shouted over the din of the howling wind. The fishermen looked around in amazement. They had expected to commune with the foreigner in Castilian. However, the strange man had spoken in a dialect native to Andalusia. Yes, the catch is usually good in this season. But what brings you to this part of the world? The fisherman inquired, unable to contain his curiosity.
Arun pointed eastwards and said, I am a trader from Turkey. I have a ship bound to Gimlik. It will be sailing out of Cadiz in few days. Ahern gazed at other members of the group and then continued, I am in Chipiona for respite, and it has been a delightful stay. The fisherman nodded once and then turned to his fellows. By now his men had laid the trasmalo on the beach, and one of the lads was throwing around baskets for sorting the day's catch. Arun had arrived in Chipiona 2 days ago. The trip was recommended by Miguel, the harbor master at Cadiz port. During his earlier visits to Spain, he had thoroughly explored Cadiz and Seville. but this time he had seen a lot more of the country. A little over 3 weeks ago, Arun's ship Umut had docked in Almeria. There it offloaded some of its cargo of spices and textiles, and then continued to its onward course around the Iberian Peninsula. Arun had stayed behind and traveled to Guadix, accompanying a caravan of traders, and from there he had traveled to Madrid by rail. To Arun, the capital Madrid had seemed a dun and ragged desolation, enclosed by mountains of dull, lifeless blue, but the city's royal museum altered his first impression. Enthralled by its vast collection, he had spent several days perusing the works of Spain's greatest artists. After a week-long stay in Madrid, he journeyed to Cadiz by rail. Here he had acquired sugar and cocoa from a South American merchant, and the cargo had been secured in one of the storehouses near the port. En route to Cadiz, the Umut's journey plan indicated about 5 days to landfall. Arun had time for leisure, and so he had decided to act on the recommendation of his friend Miguel. Ahead of him, the Faro loomed large. Arun stopped abruptly to gaze upon the beautiful sandstone structure. Over 200 feet high, the tower caught the rays of the sun, shimmering with ethereal brilliance against the deep blue of the Atlantic. The Faro was a beacon that guided ships to the mouth of the Guadalquivir, and it could be sighted from a distance of 20 nautical miles out in the sea. Arun took a sharp right turn and walked over the dunes towards Avenida de la Regia, and after a short walk he arrived at the convent of Senora de Regia. Entering the building through its central high-arched doorway, he found himself in a chapel which was deserted except for a dark-haired man seated in a pew at the far side of the altar. The man was mending a rosary, and he looked up as Arun approached. "Buenos dias! Good day!" Arun greeted, trying to keep his voice low.
"Buenos dias," returned the man and continued to stare fixedly at the foreigner. "I have heard that the convent's library is open to public during morning hours." "Ah, so you want to access the library?" The man got off the pew and gestured for Arun to follow.
They walked through the central doorway and turned left into a corridor. There was a locked door at the end of the corridor, and as they reached it, the man pulled open the door to reveal a flight of stairs. It was wide enough to allow both men to walk side by side. On reaching the top, they turned left into a narrow passageway that opened into a large chamber.
"Library, it's open for another 2 hours," the man intoned.
Arun extracted a copper peseta from his pocket and passed it to him. Taking the peseta, the man turned and hurried back through the narrow passageway. The library was well illuminated by light filtering through a large stained glass window. Arun walked around inspecting the collection. Scriptures and commentaries were held in a glass-fronted cabinet. Open shelves lined the walls, with books on liturgical works, canon law, history, philosophy, humanities, and sciences. As he completed the circuit of the chamber, he stumbled upon what he was looking for: newspapers. The newspapers and gazettes were categorized based on region. Under America, he found copies of New York Times, Chicago Tribunal, and La Nación, the latest of which bore the publication date of over 8 months ago. He checked for papers from Europe: the Daily Telegraph, La Petite, Berliner Tageblatt, and Corriere della Sera. These were from 6 months ago. The library's collection also included papers from Africa, Middle East, India, and China, but even these were not current. Arun straightened up and shrugged in submission.
"Can I help you with anything?" came a clear voice from behind.
As Arun turned, he met the sharp gaze of a man who was about as tall as himself. He was dressed in a dark coat with a cravat of black silk showing from under his white shirt. Sharp jawline, pointed nose, and fashionably combed dark hair, the face looked distinctly familiar.
"Mattoni, Virgilio Mattoni," Arun muttered softly.
For a brief moment, Virgilio looked embarrassed, but instantly he regained composure.
"I am sorry. The newspapers and gazettes have not been refreshed for quite a while, but I do have the latest issues from major international and national press, if you'd like to see them."
Arun nodded, and Virgilio gestured for him to follow. There was a narrow door besides the cabinet of scriptures. It led into a room which was dominated by a large table placed in the center. Ample sunlight flooded the room through a partially unshuttered window that looked out upon the front yard of the convent. Virgilio motioned for Arun to sit and proceeded towards a large cabinet set against the wall. On the floor besides the cabinet lay an open leather trunk. It was empty save for a few items of clothing that lined its bottom. Virgilio Mattoni was a popular Spanish artist from Seville. Aharon had seen some of his works at the Royal Museum in Madrid. His portrait depicting King Fernando III's deathbed and the Baths of Caracalla were among his most notable works, which were prominently displayed in the Royal Museum. He had also seen a portrait of Virgilio in the gallery. It had been sketched and painted by his contemporary, who was also from Seville. The portrait, Aharon recalled, was vividly detailed, and seeing Virgilio in person for the first time today felt like seeing the portrait come to life. On the table, Virgilio stacked recent issues of the Daily Telegraph, New York Times, La Petite, and the Egyptian Gazette Al Ahram. Aharon checked the date and found that these were fairly recent. In fact, the Daily Telegraph and La Petite were releases from just 12 days ago.
Do you have anything from Germany and India? Aharon inquired.
Virgilio retreated from the cabinet and placed recent issues of Berliner Tageblatt and the Hindu in front of Aharon.
Gracias, thank you, said Aharon courteously.
The 19th century, especially the latter half of it, was an age of industrial progress, expansion of empires, and rapid evolution of global culture. There was constant rivalry among European nations which had established colonies in Asia, Africa, and South America. This had made the world more connected than ever before, as railway and telegraph now spanned across all habitable continents. The recently opened Suez Canal allowed ships originating from Western Europe to reach India in about 3 weeks. In Europe, industrialization had disrupted the feudal society and created a middle class comprising of merchants, engineers, professionals, and skilled workers. An increasing number of Europeans were migrating to America, Africa, Asia, and Australia in pursuit of aspirations. The influx of Europeans in other continents had induced significant change in indigenous societies. Just like in Europe, an aspirational middle class had emerged across all continents, while the peasantry bore the brunt of colonial exploitation. Just a few years ago, a great famine had caused nearly 10 million deaths in India. The colonial powers emphasized on cash crops, which depleted soil quality, leading to subsequent failure of food crops. There had also been famines in China, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Latin America. In general, the peasantry lived under dire conditions because European powers had stripped them of their land rights and levied high taxes through subjugation of local rulers. For Aharon, it was important to stay updated about key events unfolding in distant parts of the world. Having a worldview had enabled him to explore new trading opportunities, and it was also crucial to fulfilling another secret purpose of his life. He could read, write, and speak in Arabic, English, Swahili, Spanish, French, German, and his native tongue, Turkish. This allowed him to gain varying perspectives about ongoing world events. Having gone through recent publications from America, Europe, and Asia, Aharon was now leafing through Al Ahram when Virgilio cleared his throat audibly.
Hal intahait, are you done? Virgilio inquired in formal Arabic. Why? Is it closing time? Aharon continued in Arabic with a hint of amusement showing in his voice. Well, you can have a few more minutes until I put these away, Virgilio said, indicating the pile of papers which Aharon had set aside after he'd perused them.
It took few minutes for Aharon to update himself on the affairs of Egypt and North Africa. Virgilio was not in the room, so he arranged the paper neatly and carried it into the library. He handed the paper to Virgilio, who had by now refreshed the newspaper shelves.
Aren't you a civilian? Aharon inquired as Virgilio slid Al Ahram into its designated spot on the shelf. That I am, but this village happens to be my birthplace, and I have taken up the responsibility for the upkeep of this library.
By now, Virgilio had turned away from the shelf to face Aharon. And in that moment, Aharon Yildikim made the most important decision of his life.
Meet me at Faro tomorrow noon, Aharon commanded softly.
Virgilio stood still. For a moment he felt unsure, but the stranger standing opposite him seemed to be a man of wisdom and purpose. So after a brief pause, Virgilio nodded in agreement.
Buenos dias, Aharon said, then turned around and slowly walked out of the library.
The following day, Aharon reached the Faro a little before noon. He walked around the lighthouse towards its northern face to take refuge under its comfortable shadow, cast by the low November sun. In Andalusia, all activity ceased around noon, as it was a common practice for people to retire into their houses for lunch and siesta when the sun was at its zenith. Even caravans and hunting parties would halt and encamp for an entire afternoon. In evening, people would come out of their houses, resuming their work and enterprise with renewed vigor. Even travelers would break camp to continue with the onward journey until nightfall. As Arun waited, he adjusted the knot of the woolen cuff band that was tied to his right wrist. He fingered the band lovingly. It had been in his possession for over 20 years. Now he saw Virgilio walking towards him. With another few steps, he closed the distance between them.
Nimni Ahrun Yeldikim, mimi nimfanya biashara kutoka Uturuki. I am Ahrun Yeldikim. I am a trader from Turkey. Ahrun spoke loudly in Swahili, his voice loud enough to carry over the din of waves and wind. Why have you called me here, Ahrun Yeldikim? Virgilio continued in Swahili. People know me as a trader, but I serve a purpose that is unknown to anyone but me. Why are you telling this to me? Virgilio inquired. Ana arajul mina zil. I am the man from the shadow, Arun said in Arabic, and then continued after a pause. My purpose is to ensure that humanity thrives. Others have served this purpose before me. Arun paused again. And now I choose you to serve this purpose.
Virgilio spoke after a long pause. I accept responsibility for the purpose that you've served until now.
Then my instruction to you is to stay in the shadows and do everything in your power to ensure that humanity thrives. Arun declared in English, and then, rolling up his right sleeve, he undid the woolen cuff band and offered it Virgilio.
Virgilio took the band and tied it to his right wrist. The band looked old, but it wasn't worn. With this simple ceremony witnessed by the wind, the waves, and the looming faro, a new link was forged in a long chain. The faro's shadow had lengthened slightly while the two men spoke. Having passed the baton, Arun bade farewell and headed out in the southerly direction, while Virgilio continued to linger in the shade. Seville, Spain, December 1879. It was 2 p.m, and the narrow alleyways of Santa Cruz were deserted. Through a Moorish window, Virgilio saw a cat dash across the empty street. He continued to stare at the spectacle of desolation for several minutes before returning to his study. He had in front of him the day's issue of La Floresta Andaluza. Flipping through its pages, he glossed over the headlines concerning international conflicts, the Conservative Party, affairs of the royal family, and crime. On the penultimate page, there was something about a shipwreck in the Strait of Gibraltar. On Sunday, a fishing party from Tarifa rescued 2 men from the Strait of Gibraltar. The men were taken ashore, and upon inquiry it was found that they were on a ship named Umut, which was bound to Turkey. According to the accounts of survivors, collision with another vessel seems to be the likely cause of wreckage. I was asleep in my cabin, and when I woke up, I realized I was in the sea, recounted one of the survivors. No other rescues have been made so far, and it is likely that the crew of Umut and the other vessel perished in the tragic accident. Reading the news brought back the memory of the strange conversation that had transpired between him and Arun while they stood under the shade of the faro. Virgilio had made elaborate plans to fulfill the purpose that had been passed on to him by the man from the shadows. However, there was something important and urgent that had to be done now. 2 foreigners were stranded in Tarifa, and it was his responsibility to dispatch them to their home.